So, David, immense thanks for agreeing to do this interview. I wanted to start with a question about your lifetime. I mean, you were born in 1950, 1 year after me. How do you feel about the time in which you've grown up and become what you've become? Do you feel you were lucky or unlucky?
Oh, well, spectacularly lucky. I should point out that while 10% of science fiction authors are scientifically trained, as I am,
Mm-hmm.
and I put a lot of science into a lot of my fiction, that which is not just wild and woolly literary fantasy, having fun or poking at human nature, but some of the best hard science fiction is written by history majors, former history majors, like Greg Bear, Nancy Kress, Sheila Finch, and Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah.
And that's because what's more essential to science fiction is discussion of the human condition and the possibilities of change. It should have been named speculative history, not rather than science fiction, because we speculate on the great story, which is humanity's gradual climb, 3 steps forward, 10 to the side, 2 steps back, sometimes thwarted by the best of intentions by our ancestors who had the wrong ideas, and faithfully and devotedly and lovingly enforced them and held us back. And one of the deep concerns of science fiction and of people like you, John, today is, gosh, what mistakes are we making that they'll say that about us in the future, that are preventing us from being achieving the number one goal of any decent person, and that's to be good ancestors.
I think I told you, but the first book of yours I read was Earth, which I think came out in 1990. And the only previous science fiction author I think I also told you that I'd met was Frank Herbert back in the early 1980s. And you both had very strong ecological themes. And I think back to the novel Earth, and that had global warming and the levees breaking, and it had ecological refugees and ecological terrorism. Where did that come from? And did you feel a bit of a loner at that time in having that sort of content?
Well, I was certainly not the first in science fiction or literature to warn about ecological problems. I think my niche was a slightly more optimistic one, as a matter of fact, though people took Earth, as they should, as a dire warning. Yes, overall, in the grand scheme of things, it was an early ecological warning novel.
Yeah.
But again, not as dire as, say, Soylent Green, or the movie, Silent Running. One of the themes I talk about in my new nonfiction book, Vivid Tomorrows, Science Fiction in Hollywood, it just came out, is that the most powerful form of science fiction is the self-preventing prophecy. Those ecological novels I spoke of, and the movies more than that, the movies that were made from them, Soylent Green, for example, recruited millions of environmentalists. And if we squeak by, it will be because millions of people have been trying to get attention. Well, since the 50s, I've been a member of the Sierra Club since around 1965. But certainly after those films recruited tens of millions more, dire warnings like the China syndrome drew attention to things that might have gone much worse otherwise. The movies about pandemic made us more prepared. We should have been more than we were, and there's every reason to believe that this current pandemic is much milder than we've seen in science fiction. It's horrible, and will tune us to be better prepared for worse. And the long list of science fiction movies and books that might have saved us all from nuclear war Dr. Strangelove, On the Beach, Failsafe, War Games, each of them took a different potential way that accidental nuclear war might happen. And at the time, the generals claimed, oh, that's ridiculous. And then when they retired, they wrote books saying, oh, that we really sweated over that.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
So, but the granddaddy of all self-preventing prophecies is undoubtedly George Orwell's 1984.
Yeah.
Which scared the living bejesus out of hundreds of millions of people and propelled many of them to dedicate part of their lives to preventing it from happening.
Yeah.
Now, it's an ironic thing because in normal times, the anti-Orwellian reflex of someone on the left is to say, Big Brother is coalescing before our eyes amid the aristocracy, the oligarchy, the rich, and the corporations. And your reflex, if you're somewhat to the right or libertarian, is to say Big Brother is forming among snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats. In normal times, when we listen to each other at least a little bit, this manifests as guarding each other's backs.
Yeah.
You know, I believe my elites are more trustworthy than yours, but you're welcome to yell at and criticize mine, just in case I'm wrong. The worst thing that has been done to our civilization in the last 20 years by our enemies has been to end this synergy and to get hundreds of millions of people to assume that their elites are completely safe and the other side doesn't have a point at all.
What do you think is the natural progression there? I mean, you studied civilizations and history enough to get a sense of rhythms and patterns. Do you see one here?
The memes that have been spread by Hollywood for at least 70 years, more like 100, have progressively pushed toward several lessons that I point out in my book, Vivid Tomorrows. Suspicion of authority is the central one, and it's being used against us now, but it is fundamentally a very, very positive meme because, and you see this in every film that you've ever enjoyed. Hollywood preaches suspicion of authority, tolerance, diversity, eccentricity. Beginning of any film, the hero or heroine usually exhibits some eccentric trait, and that fact helps the audience bond with her, despite the fact that it's not your eccentric trait. Just the fact that they are eccentrically individualistic in some way helps the audience to bond. So if this process is allowed to continue much longer, then the very notion of a pyramidal structure will just be completely nonsensical, as it is to a large fraction of the Earth's population now.
But you read science fiction from all around the world, and I imagine you read Chinese science fiction. And what do you most admire out of that sort of canon? And do you think that would have a similar corrosive effect on Chinese hierarchies, or are there exceptions to that unified field theory?
Well, I have a picture of Liu Cixin and me posing behind that in front of that painting right behind me. He was here 2 years ago. I helped promote the three-body problem when it came out in English. And I think he's wonderful. And I think that the renaissance of wonderful stories coming out of Asia is a tremendous contribution to the literature of change and of criticism. I said, wouldn't it be great if you had a database that you could surreptitiously or anonymously say, are there science fiction stories that depict this? And have a throng of nerds out there say, oh yeah, analog July 1952. This story by what's-his-face showed that this or such might happen, and the government officials would assume naturally that it means A, but naturally, it being a story, the government officials were wrong and it was actually B. Well, you know, that's not going to solve the problem of some future agency facing unknown, but it is likely to offer them a series of pre-worked out thought experiments, or as Einstein called it, Gedanken experiments,
Yeah.
That would inform and broaden their horizons, possibly in a very hurried emergency. So a couple of years ago, I helped to establish the Arthur C. Clarke Center of Human Imagination at UCSD. And one of our projects was to create this database called TASAT. And it stands for There's a Story About That. You come up with a scenario that maybe might be coming true. You don't have to admit that it is, but you query about the scenario, and ideally a critical mass of sci-fi reading nerds responds with, you know, there's a story about that. Now, we got it started a couple of years ago and it got spammed and it just wasn't the right design. So TASAT is being redesigned now and rebuilt.
That's good to hear.
However, I do invite folks to drop by and at least read the perfectly functional introductory part of the site, and it is tasat.ucsd.edu.
When I looked at your profile on Wikipedia, one of the things it talked about was the Judaic tradition and the idea of repairing the world. Now, I don't know whether that is something you have expressed or whether something's been invented for you on your behalf by some anonymous writer, but does that make sense?
Oh, yes. It's called Tikkun Olam.
Yeah.
I actually, if there are any theological types out there, I have a monograph I've been working on.
I'd love to see it.
Called 16 Modern Questions about Theology. And it's not anti-religion. It just goes into more of an enlightenment, more of a science fictional set of questions about theology that haven't been in a lot of theological speculation. But Tikkun Olam is a concept that either because he is not entirely omnipotent, or because he made the world and is willing to abide by the simulation and see what comes out of it. For either reason, either lack of total omnipotence or great interest in how the experiment is going to go, the world's creator needs human help. And therefore, the world itself needs to be our focus and not the individual soul. The individual soul is going to take care of itself. We don't have to keep begging for salvation of something that either we'll earn it or we won't. Obsession with the individual soul is one of the things that you find across a great many religions. But in Tikkun Olam, the notion is, no, we have duties. And one of the duties is to this world. And if we don't repair what we can repair, that's sin.
If there's one book that you think sort of distills your thinking, would there be one, or
no? But
would it be 20?
Which of your children is your favorite child? They're all different.
Yeah.
But of course, the one that is in 25 languages because of the Kevin Costner film.
Yes.
And the one that I think makes more people cry and makes more people feel a little bit of renewed dedication to save this civilization is called the postman.
David, that's been joyous. You've sort of renewed my dedication. Thank you immensely for it.